Welcome to the Film Riot Podcast. I'm Ryan Conley, and today on the show we have Scott Glassgold. Scott has been on the show before. He's a manager and producer, owner of Ground Control, and he's no stranger to getting films set up and getting films made. And that's something I wanted to pick his brain a little bit about today. As independent filmmakers, it's always in the back of our mind to just go out there and make a film ourselves and at scale, and always thinking on how do you do that? What is the first step and all the subsequent steps after that? And it's definitely something that's been on my mind lately as well. So I was really excited to do a Twitter Spaces with Scott to talk about that live. And at the end of this, you're going to hear a few questions from the participants of that Spaces for Scott as well. So there's a lot to get into. And of course, it is a Twitter Spaces, so the audio is not 100%, but it's totally passable. But I'm going to shut up now and get into it with Scott. What I'm interested in picking your brain on is how to get a film on its legs. I would love to start from step one and sort of move down the line. But let's say there's a filmmaker and they have their idea. They've built out a treatment even, and they're happy with it. What would you say is the next step towards making this thing happen? And I'm not necessarily saying to take it to a studio and try to get it set up there. Maybe that's a part of the process, but I mean more make it happen one way or the other, whether it's the studio world or whether it's just making the thing yourself. I guess this is a double question here, but do you think they should, in that, thought process, be thinking, why don't I try to pitch this first, give it X period of time, and then if no one takes it, screw it, I'll make it myself? Or do you think they should just beeline right toward making it themselves?
It's a great question, and it's layered, right? So we'll probably have a few questions within what is, the umbrella question. I think first and foremost, it matters where the person is in their career. I think if we're having this conversation, most likely someone's looking to be breaking in, which is fantastic. Everybody's got to break in at some point. But I say that to say, you had mentioned the idea of maybe having a treatment in hand or something like that. I really think if it's your first go around and you're looking to sort of break through, you need a real foundation to the material that you're looking to build out. And primarily, I would say that would include a screenplay, particularly if you're going the route of indie. It's essential. Like there's no way around it. I think you'd be very hard pressed to sort of gain momentum by way of financing and or talent attachments or anything else without a script in hand. And that dovetails, I guess, if we're sort of bifurcating this approach. If we're talking about a studio approach and you're a first timer, I really think the only way to sort of break through and get the studio's attention is if you've created some sort of IP that could function as the key to unlocking the kingdom, if you will. So that could be a short film, that could be a comic book, that could be a Reddit no sleep story for sure. It could be maybe an article or something that's sort of gone viral online. In that regard, if you're looking to sort of, get into the studio, that's a way to beat it without a screenplay. But from an indie perspective, it's certainly script. And look, I'm sure there's going to be an exception, and I would, immediately concede, but let's just call it rule of thumb anyway.
So would you say then with the script in hand, would you still need that additional IP you were talking about, be it podcast, comic book, short story, short film, whatever it is? If you're trying to break in, you have a body of work already, somebody like myself, a Ryan Booth, a Seth Worley, that already has a, proven body of work that you can show. Would you say still, even with a feature script in hand, would you still need that additional piece of material?
No, I definitely wouldn't. I was really sort of basing that off of the idea of without a script, which ultimately is your blueprint to the movie that you want to make, you would need just something to substantiate it. Having said that, using you as a perfect example, you've got a really sick body of work that definitely demonstrates your ability to direct. So I think that's sort of like, you can scratch that off of the list of concerns. So I don't think you necessarily need an IP. Now, look, it's, is it gasoline on the fire? Sure. Heck yeah. But in terms of a necessity, I think it starts and ends with the script and using that to build from there.
This is kind of like a side note, but I just, got curious from your last answer. Do you think there's a world where that additional bit of IP, the short film, whatever it is, could actually go against you with the feature script? Say if you're taking it to a production company with that thing and it's not lining up with how they were reading it, you know what I mean? Like, is that ever a consideration when you're coming up with sort of your game plan and taking it out of this kind of hurts it, maybe don't do that or don't package it with that?
That's interesting. If the short film doesn't necessarily inform inform the script, yeah, you might want to make a choice to separate them. Having said that, if the short is really good and demonstrates your ability and demonstrates some areas of the film that you want to keep. For example, if it's a horror film and you've demonstrated a really good looking creature, you're going to want to show that creature. If it's an action movie and you've got a sequence in there that will really speak to the type of action you want in your film, that'll affect it as well.
So if you have the script in hand, and let's say it's a concept, it's a feature script that definitely feels like this could be something you take to a production company or studio, or this is something you could do yourself. It's in that bit of a sweet spot where you could do it for, that indie tiny budget and pull in the finances yourself to do it. What would be your approach? What would be your advice to that filmmaker? Would it be to try the production company studio route first and give it a finite period of time and move on, or just go straight to making the thing?
Let's sort of break it down a little bit. So I think there's pros and cons to both approaches. And I think it's about really looking at what your goal is. I think if your goal is truly about seeing your movie through and like this is your baby, right? Then I think you hang on to it and you do it indie. The case anybody would make would be like, well, if I'm doing this, of course it's my baby. But I think that's not always the case. And what I mean by that is, the calling card that turns into something transactional that gets you on the sort of the filmmaking map, the studio map that you use as a stepping stone is super interesting and super viable. But if you're telling something that's like really personal or something that you've been dying to tell for the last 20 years, then I would say indie is the route, because most likely it's going to crash and burn at the studio. There's just so much attrition there by way of executives, by way of development. I mean, frankly, we are in sea change after sea change, whether it be the oncoming of streaming, theatrical with a question mark around it, COVID, all these things make, a studio setup. It just seems like there's been these kind of like tectonic shifts in the last few years that nobody can foresee. And when it comes to a development project, particularly one that wouldn't necessarily be the highest of profile for them, right? We're talking about a first timer versus, for example, all of these curveballs that we've seen. I mean, look, I was going to use Chris Nolan as an example, but even he faced curveballs, right? With his last movie of like, when is this thing going to be released? So no one ultimately is immune to it. And the lower you are on the Hollywood totem pole, the more likely you are to succumb to it. So I say that to say, if you've built something that you can make for $5 and under, and you don't necessarily need a studio apparatus, I would hang on to it for dear life. And even if it takes you a while, that would be the approach I would take.
That makes a lot of sense too, because just even from my perspective and, friends on my similar level, it's, that first one is that barrier to entry. It seems like that really hard wall to get through is just that first film. So making it yourself seems to, from people that I've seen, is to break through that wall finally and then move on to the next one. Because all of a sudden you're viable. You did a longer version of the thing you've already done, which is just an interesting thing in and of itself. But say, okay, so you have this spec and you did decide, I'm not going to go to studios. I am going to try to do this thing myself. You got notes from trusted friends. You have it in a place you're really happy with. What then would be the next step? If you were the mentor over, say, this is a writer director, what would they do next? Would the next thing be to find specific roles to then help them get this rolling in a certain way? Or, what's that next step?
Well, I would say even in sort of the blueprinting of the script, hopefully you factored in, at least on the sort of the back of an envelope, what you can pull off. For example, if you live in Nebraska and you set your movie in Hawaii, you already have a strike against you. So hopefully you've designed a script that at least will play to your strengths. You can use this warehouse as a studio. Friends sort of abandoned car lot, whatever it is, you want to start there. So that way you're at least, there's so many elements out of your control in making a film, or at least elements that you need to ultimately wrangle, right? The ones that you can set up in your favor out of the gate will just make your life that much easier. So, that ought to be factored in when you're designing the film, first and foremost. Then having said that, let's say you've done that, right? Like, let's say that's an assumption we'll just make. Off of that, what I would say is find a line producer, and either, you've got a friend who could budget it for you, or through a few clicks of the internet, you can get some recommendations on a line producer. And I think that's probably money well spent to get a gauge of what your movie will cost. So that way, whether it's you looking in the eye of a financier, or even as you start to look at casting, you know what you need to support the budget level that you have. Hopefully you're making something small and achievable, and the premium on securing a named talent is minimal, if nothing at all. And then equally, whether it's to the financier, again, it's like, hopefully you design something where the ask is not extraordinary. But I do think having that budget in hand sort of sets everything else in motion. I think what it'll do is allow you to then say, okay, my budget came in. This is a line producer who's worked on 100 movies. I trust their assessment. My budget is $3 million. So then with that comes so many things, right? It's like, okay, how do I get $3 million? My first thing is, well, do I live in a rebate state? Can I shoot this in a rebate state? Because or rebate country for that matter? Because all of a sudden you have what is basically free money coming at you right away, right? So, for example, we're looking to do a movie right now in Puerto Rico. That's a 40% rebate. That's a huge amount of money you get back. You can make a $4 million movie for 2.5 or whatever, right? Round it up, down, it doesn't matter. The point remains the same, where I think those type of calculations, all of a sudden, you could be looking at having a third of your budget in hand before you've done anything, with zero risk. Look, rebates are not necessarily the easiest to achieve. Each state, each country is unique, but it's certainly something that you can time, that you can explore and start using in a way where you're not financially exposed. And that's super important.
That rebate thing is a really great one and really interesting. And that is, as a writer, director, not my world. So who is it that I would go after to help, wrangle something like that? Is it a producer, or who would I need to get on board to help know the workings of those sorts of things?
It certainly could be a producer, but, the truth is, every state is very specific. So there's versions of it where, let's say, for example, you're hiring a line producer and you have an inclination that, let's say you want to shoot it in your home state that has a decent rebate, right? Then I would look to hire a line producer who's worked in the state, who can maybe help me navigate this. Because a lot of the questions that need to be answered within securing a rebate will ultimately run through the line producer as well. A lot of the requirements come down to how many people are being employed in state, how many jobs are you creating, these type of things that, again, don't get me wrong, a producer will know these things, but half the questions that come up on those rebate applications, which, I will fully admit, I've tried to fill out myself, and then I'll call my line producer and be like, I don't know the answer to this. What is this? So if you have a producer and they're already on board, great. But I wouldn't necessarily suggest securing a producer or going after a producer simply for securing a rebate. Unless it's a producer that you like, that's interested, and they've secured a rebate in that state before, then it's like, oh, great. But I wouldn't necessarily put the ultimate premium on that.
At what point do you think, the filmmaker would really want to find that producer within the process? And how would you suggest going about finding a decent producer?
I think every case is unique. It's a balance, right? Because I think our instinct always is, oh, I want, sort of a big name producer. And look, that's obviously lovely. But at the same time, particularly on a smaller film, I'm going to want the producer who finds my movie almost as important as I do. Now, and I say I as the filmmaker, right? As the writer director, I can assure you, no one is ever going to care about your movie more than you. And that's the way it's supposed to be. It's just how it is, right? You've got everything on the line for this movie. Having said that, you want a producer who's going to live and die for the movie. And I think sometimes it's about finding that emerging producer who's excited to do that, who's got something to prove, is sort of, let's just say, maybe at the same level as you. What I mean is sort of where they are in the industry anyway, or, maybe a little bit more experience. Having said that, look, if, X 800-pound gorilla producer calls you, is like, I want to produce your movie, like, take that very seriously.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
100%.
I'm not saying don't take that seriously. At the same time, oh, we love the script. It's great. We want to develop it out. And like, hang on, I've got to go to Nova Scotia for 6 months to go make my whatever movie, And look, there's not going to be a ton of money on the line for them. It's a small indie movie. So it's a balance, right? That's just this thing that you want to keep in mind. So, look, to answer your question, I do find more often than not, it's about existing relationships. If you've been creating for a little while, most likely you have a partner that you trust, or maybe you don't. And I think it is about, perhaps targeting people whose films you like. But again, not necessarily, calling, I don't know, Brian Grazer and be like, will you produce my movie?
Right.
It's like you just saw a cool, indie movie at South by. And you're like, that movie was really well put together. It feels larger than it was intended to. It's, done really well. That's an interesting producer, right? And, you're more likely to get an audience and one that would take it seriously. So to me, I think that's kind of my advice. Again, I would never dissuade, even, sometimes getting those bigger producer names and them functioning as a godfather is invaluable. There's no doubt about that.
Sure.
There's always room in the boat, but just in terms of like your ride or die partner to go all fast and furious on everyone, that's something to consider.
Yeah. And I think, something you said definitely clicked with me is that idea of if you've been creating for a while, you probably have built a bit of a community around you that you could tap into. And that's very true. Like you first start making things, you don't know anyone, but over the course of being passionate and doing thing after thing after thing, after so many years, you all of a sudden like, oh, I could reach out to this person or that person. And it does happen organically. So at least in my case, the answer to that of how to at least find people I could reach out to is what you said. It's really, really true. And I never really thought of it in those terms. Is just by creating it almost organically, shapes that community around you, and you meet like-minded people, or people reach out to you, or you're able to reach out to people through other people you've met.
And look, and by the way, I also would subscribe to the idea of like, don't wait for anybody, right? Because a lot of these things you can do on your own. You just take on that mantle until you find that person. But it doesn't mean you need to wait for that producer to do these things, whether it's the rebates that we're talking about, getting a budget on your film. I mean, even, this would bleed into probably the next step is figuring out your casting. And I think that will certainly be informed by your budget. What I mean is by being informed by your budget, it's a two-way street. One, it's knowing, what your budget is what you can ultimately afford for an actor, but equally what you need in terms of sort of the raise of the money. I mean, hopefully you've designed something that is either brilliant dramatic piece that would draw an actor, or I should say, or a very large conceptual piece that can sort of defy the need for a name actor. I mean, those are the two places you're going to want to be sort of putting your eggs. And again, similar to my disclaimer before, always will be an exception.
Yeah.
But I think those are the two things, it's just like a knockout role. And you're doing, I'm blanking on that Miles Teller drum movie.
Whiplash?
Yeah, Whiplash, where it's just so undeniably a juicy role that you can bang on people's doors, and say, hey, what about this? Or it's a horror, or it's a sci-fi, or some sort of conceptual piece that the premium on actor is less.
Yeah, and I do want to come back to cast in a second, but before we do it, I do want to talk a little bit more about budget, because there are some really scary and, mystical aspects to it. Is even like, say you find someone who is willing to finance, then what? That a lot of my questions really are, now what for you? But you find that and now what? A lot of writer directors aren't going to be the person that would know how to handle that sort of deal, or what next, and that feels very scary. So at that point, who would you need? Who would run that deal? Is there a specific role that you need to pull in at that point?
I mean, look, if you are fortunate enough to find someone who wants to finance your film, you would want to bring on a lawyer, particularly one with an expertise in indie financing. And, that isn't hard to achieve. There's a lot of very good lawyers. I wanted to sort of pause for a second. I mean, typically they're paid on commission. So, in terms of, again, always sort of approaching this with the assumption that there's not a lot of money to spend up front. But more often than not, you can find a very good lawyer who will believe in you as a filmmaker, will take a commission off of the deal rather than you having to pay them. Now, look, there is the inverse of that. Depending on your situation, pay a lawyer hourly. If you really think you're gonna knock this one out of the park, you're gonna make $100 million on your movie, and you want to insulate yourself from fees and commissions, you can do that. But my recommendation would be to, like forming any of these relationships, as you grow your career, a good lawyer is someone who can, truly guide you and hopefully is a confidant that is constantly looking out for your needs. And then when it comes to these deals, to me, particularly on first film, I think it's really about ensuring that the money is real, right? I mean, very few people get truly rich off of their first film, and that's okay. I think what you want to make sure is that the money is real and you can go make the movie that you're setting out to make. So, there's all different things to address within a contract, but I think at the end of the day, you're on day one of your movie. You want to make sure you're going to have money for day one and day 28, however long your movie is. And once you know that, look, I'm not saying ignore deal points. That's for a lawyer to get into. But you want to vet the money, and knowing that it's real it's 85% of the battle, if not more.
And say the money's real, you've vetted, everything's good to go, and you have $2 million to work with right now. Coming back around to cast, at what point are you thinking about cast, and are you making a real strategy there? How much of the budget would you allocate toward getting a notable lead, or do you even think in those terms?
I'll say this emphatically: if your money is real and they're telling you have $2 million and it's not cast dependent, that's fantastic. And at $2 million, it's not always cast dependent. Once you start creeping up to 3, 4, you better believe it's going to be cast dependent unless you find a really extraordinary financier that believes in your vision. I mean, look, when we made Prospect, I'll give, all the shout outs in the world to Aaron Gilbert and Braun, who were really taken by Zeke Earl and Chris Caldwell's vision for the movie. This fantastic lookbook that's sort of become this like viral sensation around town. Even to this day, people are like, oh, I just saw the Prospect lookbook. It's amazing. Someone's using it as an example. So it's become this really cool, showpiece. But the greater point I'm trying to make is we went in there and pitched them with a fantastic script, a great lookbook, and an existing short. And that movie was greenlit without any cast. I mean, look, we were fortunate enough to get Pedro Pascal and J.B. Ploss and just a really long list of very cool, interesting actors. Every case is unique, and that's an example of amazing financiers. I'll say that, until I'm blue in the face, but also really clear-eyed filmmakers who, I think the proof is in the pudding, who knew exactly what they wanted to do. So, both those things are factors. I got a little off the path to go back to, again, if your financier is like, go make your movie, here's $2 million. So again, if there's no prerequisite for name casting, right? That doesn't mean you throw that idea out the window, but I do think it allows you to manicure the casting process in a way that is more reflective of your vision as a filmmaker than what often happens is sort of playing to market, which isn't always bad. What happens very often on these films, and particularly ones that are, 5 million plus, it's like, well, who has foreign value, and who's it now? And that, not always, but that can fly in the face of who your top 5 choices are. Now, look, if you're making an independent film for $2 million in your first movie, your top choice, you're probably not getting that person. But that doesn't mean you can't get someone really cool or interesting, whether they're name or not, it's someone you really believe in. So I think ultimately, like, the fork in the road comes down to the ask of the financier. And if they're giving you the green light, not based on casting, I would still find that balance, because ultimately you, just like the financier, is going to want to sell this movie. So I think you want to weave together casting ideas that, have some recognition. So you're able to have sort of a zeitgeisty pulse, if you will. But at the same time, you're less enslaved to playing to market.
What about if you don't have that money yet? You're still trying to find that, to nail that down. Is there a world where you get a casting director on board and try getting that into the hands of some talent to try to, grease the wheels to get those finances that you need?
100%. I mean, that's the way to go. And there are, sort of similar to the way we were describing producers and up and coming producers. I think there are casting directors out there that maybe have a few movies under their belt and they're looking to, grow their resume, or they're really taken by your vision, or they're a friend of a friend and they'll come on to consult. And what sometimes that looks like is just sort of maybe paying them a fraction of their fee to cast the lead role. You don't have to cast the whole movie right now, let me give you 20% of your fee and help me cast the lead. And if I get the lead, everything should fall into place. So that's very much a viable path, and one that I believe in as well. I mean, I always lean into being conservative when it comes to spending money. This is a high risk business that often does not result in a film getting made, more often than not, right? So you only want to outlay so much cash, period. Having said that, line producer for a budget, casting director to help you, attract some talent so that you can next level this thing. So someone would argue that there's no money well spent when it comes to financing a film or pre-financing a film. Having said that, if you were to do that would be things that I've done in my experiences where I put my own money, just because I think that's the difference between getting this thing off the ground or not.
Is there an average to what casting director's fee might be to what, that 20% would be?
It really depends. I think for a couple $1,000s, someone might be willing to help you. It's not an insane amount of money. It's not. Like, I think it's all relative, of course, to everyone's situation. But having said that, I don't think it's this crazy astronomical number that is so unachievable.
Stepping back a little bit with, this film, the idea of what we're even talking about, doing the thing that we're doing, is an attempt in breaking in and continuing on, building your career out, career being the main question I'm about to ask. With that in mind, is there something the filmmaker who's trying to break in and say they are making their own film, whether that's a $200,000 film or a $4 million film or anything in between, is there something they should be thinking about in terms of what would be the smartest first outing for them? For instance, I have a friend who felt like he was, put in a horror corner and couldn't get out of it for like 10 years because that was his, entrance into the landscape. And so everybody just saw him as horror and he just couldn't break out of it until he was able to make something else to show that he could do something else. Or, take me, for instance, I'm a genre guy. I really love horror, but I really love sci-fi and action and, thriller. There's a wide range of things I want to do. So would it be unwise to do a straight horror right out of the gate? Would that peg me a certain way, or something with a certain high concept to get noticed to, extend your career? Or should you not think in those terms at all?
At the end of the day, when it comes time to make your movie, your first movie, I think you have to be able to look in the mirror and just know, and ask yourself, and this is probably going to sound silly and basic, but I really think it's inherent, is, can I make a good movie out of this? And this applies to all directors I work with, even when it's not their own script. It's, a work for hire, probably in particular, right? Because they're like, if it comes from your essence, more likely than not, you feel like you can pull this movie off. So then it's less qualitative about the script, but it's more situational. It's like, can I make a good movie for $200,000? Can I make a good movie for $800,000? And I don't mean that generally. I mean specific to that moment and the type of movie that it is. Can I do a good movie? And by the way, like, I would say that to a director who's been working for 20 years, who's about to, take a open assignment, the same as I would a first timer. And I would make sure you want to go take that quiet space, mull on that question, and believe it. Because if you don't think you can, and I'm not talking about self-doubt, I'm not talking about, oh shit, am I meant to do this? I think that's more situational. Right? It's like bearing in mind all the pieces on this board game here. If I do my job, which obviously if you're doing this job, you believe in yourself. So putting aside your ability, like, is the table set for me to succeed? And I think that matters more than anything, because, I can rattle off 15 names of horror filmmakers that have transcended that genre and are the biggest filmmakers of all time. So I don't think you get put in a box by way of genre. Don't get me wrong. Sometimes it gets tough and you do get stuck in your fighting element. But I don't think a director should worry about that, particularly early in his career. I think the premium should be on, can I make a great movie?
I did want to step back into kind of the production company studio world. If you're coming out to try to get something made, so you're putting together this pitch, what would you say are like the key elements to the materials that you would send out to producers, production companies that do a great job at kind of hooking and getting them wanting to know more or wanting to talk and develop something out further? What things really catch you?
First, I think it's really, really hard to get anyone's attention, myself included. And I think it's a combination of fear of spending too much time on something that just isn't good, first of all. And second of all, it's like, and I'm just sort of like giving you the unfiltered of like something lands in my inbox, right? There's a few things weighing on me. Like one is how many other people have seen this before me, right? Like, am I getting something that is fresh and new and nobody really has seen? Because that's exciting and important, because you don't want to start diving into someone and realize like, oh my God, this has been shot for the last 6 months. And the person who said it to me hasn't told me that. I'm the last one to see it, right? So it's like, you don't want to get excited about something that has been fully exposed. So I think making sure that you're curating in a way that is prizing it honestly. Like, and I think you sort of owe it to yourself too, to like not do the blast and to be really calculated, particularly as you're sort of soliciting help.
Yeah.
Because what you don't want is the material to be overexposed before it even gets out of the gate. And what I mean by that is it's like, it might be good and viable, but it also might not be totally ready. And you don't want to get that full exposure, particularly from like a buyer situation, and it's not fully cooked. So I think that's the thing to think about. You know, particularly if we're talking studios, it's very easy for me to give you examples there of like, I won't name specifically, but I have this short. It's just fantastic. It's the best short I've seen in years. The filmmakers are incredible. I believe in it wholeheartedly. So we shared it in July and everyone was like, this is bananas. Like, this is great. What's the take? So then we went and started meeting with writers. And now, you know, fortunate enough that the material was really strong. We met with 20 different writers. The filmmakers went with the writers that they liked, believe in the most. And now we're putting the pitch together and we're going to take it to market. But I say that to say it's probably not apples to apples to what we're talking about, but I think just sort of using real life examples sometimes, you know, answers a question that isn't even posed, but it's illuminating. So that was an example of market reacting really strong to the material, but still sort of saying, because it was a short film, we need a take. And I think 5 years ago, you could probably just sell a short without a take. You don't need it. It's a little different now. But at the same time, I didn't blow it out to buyers. Look, if someone ended up slipping the short to the buyer, great, fine, whatever. The short in of itself stands on its own. But it's not like I said, hey, I don't know, Netflix, get on a call with these filmmakers and hear what they have to say. Now, look, the filmmakers are fantastic, but English is their second language and then never have pitched before. And nor have they written, you know, professionally. They're great filmmakers in terms of directors. So I'm not going to put them in a situation where they're pitching to Netflix with a take that they haven't really come up with yet. But if Netflix sees the short and they're excited about it and they can't wait to hear take, great. The string that I'm sort of pulling out to answer your question is it comes down to exposing material and, you know, sort of not going whole hog, for lack of a better expression, until you really know your presentation is ready for prime time.
Yeah, that's a great answer. That was awesome. I did bring up someone for a question. This is Cameron Gallagher. He actually has a short film of his own. He's a horror filmmaker, incredibly talented. He has a short film called The Rickety Man, which has just won a ton of awards, hasn't it?
That's actually what I was hopping on here for. I had a couple of questions about some festivals. One thing that I was kind of looking at is, you know, we are starting to kind of create a little bit of a buzz. And one thing that I like to try to do is obviously be as proactive as possible. What are some ways that you think you can kind of maybe go outside of the box and be proactive about it?
It's funny. The times have changed, right? There was a time where you did a great short and you dropped it on Vimeo or YouTube and sent it to a couple sites and you could really turn this town upside down in 24 hours. I don't know if people, you know, sort of grew a little tired of that, or the splash of a viral short, you know, just sort of we're all sort of numb to news and anything exciting on the internet. I can't put my finger exactly on what changed. So having said that, I think it's less about the viral nature of it and really more about just having the goods. So like if you really like your short and you really believe in it, I think the question goes back to kind of the point that I was making earlier on the last idea of exposing a short. We're going to go on the assumption that it's really well made. It's your short. It's in festivals. People really like it. So then I think the next question is, do you have a calling card or do you have a transactional piece of IP? A calling card, I would veer more towards making sure you have a rep and making sure it's blasted out and you're taking tons of general meetings where you're, you know, end up on lists where people are considering directors. Now, if it's transactional, by transactional, I mean it's a concept that's so rich that there is a potential path to turn it into a feature film. If that's what you're looking at, then I would say, what's the take? Like, what's the big idea? And if it's something that you're emphatic about writing, then you need to come up with an airtight pitch. If you don't have a script under your belt, or you want to bring in another writer to work with you, I think it's about that. It's about, finding that partner, and going back to the example I just made of like, so that way, rather than you just getting on a call and sort of winging a pitch, you call a timeout, even if it's 3 months, but you just get this really great airtight pitch together and then roll it out. That's where you really make an impression.
TJ, you got a question for Scott?
I do. First of all, thank you as always, both of you, for coming on and doing this. My question is, if I'm in a position, I kind of have like a American Animals-esque heist movie. I have my script. I have my writer, die producer. If we're working in this under $1 million budget, likely is the next step, go out and try and cast that first, or are we better off trying to attach in a producer? My producer right now has no feature credits to our name. And so is it, in order to have it be taken seriously as a real project, do we need a slightly older, slightly more established producer to be attached?
Yes and no. And what I mean by that is, I think if you can get yourself in a position where you can make a real offer, where let's say your movie's $1 million, but you want to go after a really interesting actor, maybe they're worth $100,000, right? So it's like, hey, X actor, here's a movie. If we get this thing going, we'll give you $100,000, right? So then, yes, you have a $1.1 million movie, but it's with, I don't know who the actor is, but it's someone that you're excited about, that's meaningful, and that is willing to do it. Then so a $1 million movie with no name actor, or a $1.1 million movie with a pretty cool, interesting actor that also, by the way, may become a magnet for financiers, may become a magnet for other actors, is worth it. So I think it comes down to your math a little bit in terms of your budget and what you're looking at. I think it's about not being afraid to go after talent and sort of backing offers, if you will. Now, look, you don't want it to be vapor, because any agent worth their salt will be like, these guys are bozos, like they're offering money they don't really have. So there's always a balance, right? You never want to deceit, because for 100 reasons, right? Like our mothers weren't wrong. But beyond that, you don't want to burn your credibility. What you want to do is sort of, be forthright and be like, look, we've got financiers. We want to go to you're the actor that you represent. We think it'd be perfect for it. If we get our money together, we can pay him $100,000. And like, these things happen, so it's like you kind of lay it all on the table, and chances are you're not going after the biggest name in the world. Don't, by the way, if you are, but more so, like, you probably aren't. And, you can get an audience. And for actors, even protect maybe, older ones who aren't working as much, like it's all viable and things to think about.
George, you got a question for Scott here?
How to get the budget for like a TV series, essentially.
The interesting thing about TV is, again, I always speak in generals, like listen to what I say and break the rule and prove me wrong. But having said that, generally speaking, TV is interesting because it's far more predicated on experience than film. A financier or studio is far more likely to hand a first-timer a $5 million movie than to give someone a TV series. Logistically, running a show is very different than a film. So I think that's a very, very tall mountain to try to climb without any TV experience. Having said that, we live in the luxury of a time where you can self-produce. And my advice would be to not start out looking to do a television series, but like try to do a digital series. And there are numerous examples of shows that have migrated from digital to TV where they were basically bootstrapping it. Broad City is a great example of that. And there's a handful of others. This is what's coming to mind right now, where they bootstrapped it and they did smaller versions of the vision of their show, maybe, 10 episode run, made it very clear what they were capable of. And then, you're sort of, I think, neutralizing that experience question a lot. It's like, hey, I just did it for no money. We did 10 episodes. We have 1 million views each episode. People love us. We're great. So that would be my approach. I think, you're a creator looking to run into Netflix to get money for a show. That's a huge mountain. Now, look, the other version of it is I would then definitely say to you, well, go shoot a sizzle, go shoot some sort of pilot that is really designed to sell your vision and make it undeniable. I mean, the most recent example, and even that is not one I would, expect anyone to replicate, is what they did with the Fresh Prince show, right? Where a filmmaker independently did the dramatic version of it. I mean, it was really well done and just conceptually turned something inside out. And then, so not only did he have to do that, the stars had a line to where, like, Will Smith wasn't even an IP he controlled, right? Like, again, and this is where I go to the prove me wrong section of Twitter Spaces, where, like, if that filmmaker whose name I'm blanking on got on Twitter Spaces, was like, hey, I want to go do that. It could be a great calling card, but the chances of it being great, Will Smith wanting to do, the whole thing, it's just that's a perfect hand you just played, right? And you don't necessarily want to rely on playing a perfect hand. Vision trumps everything, right? He had a vision. He knew exactly what he wanted to do. He did it perfectly, and the rest is history. But I do think that there's a way to mitigate risk in what we're talking about, particularly if it's your own IP. Go shoot a couple episodes, figure out how to finance that. Do it on a budget, because it's okay. Like the Always Sunny in Philadelphia guys did their pilot for nothing. There's a long history of examples of people pulling together their vision for their TV show and it being found, and they've become hit shows. Outside of that, you can take that swing, but it's really tough. Like independent TV on a regular sort of TV scale, it doesn't really work, or doesn't work often anyway. Let me say that.
That's awesome. And great question. And you're right, Scott. That's a good point. I don't think we've ever really talked about, series in that way before. And it is interesting how much harder it is to get into series. I mean, there was one bit of negotiations we were doing, and it was understood that if this was picked up for a large series, there's no way in hell you're directing. But if this is a feature, yeah, you're locked, you're directing. And it's like, oh, okay. It's interesting how much more of a difficult get that is. But it does make sense. Like you said, it's just a much bigger beast to manage.
You're deficit financing a television show to where you don't really make money unless it's 3 or 4 years on the air.
Right.
Who am I going to bet on? I'm going to bet on the guy who just ran a show before or co-ran a show before, because it's just entirely different. It's a marathon, not a sprint, whereas a film would be a sprint.
And that's it for today. Huge thank you to Scott for taking the time, as always. And of course, you can jump over to filmriot.com/podcast, find the episode page for this episode. You can find more for Scott there, including links to his social media. You can find me online at twitter.com/Ryan_Connolly. And until next time, don't forget to write, shoot, edit, repeat.